Hey witches, it's Taya, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about fairies. Specifically, I want to talk about Brian Froud and his depiction of fairies, and I thought what better work to look at for a little bit of fun than Lady Cottington's pressed fairy book. That was, the text is done by Terry Jones and the illustrations are done by Brian Froud. It is a beautiful book that was published in 1991. And it is the story of Lady Angelica Cottington. It's her story from about 1895 when she's 7 years old through to 1909 when she turns 21 and stops seeing the fairies. And yeah, it's a fun story. It is loosely based on the Cottingley fairies. They were photos that were published in 1917 by Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths. They're two young girls who at the time were thought to have captured actual fairies on film for the first time ever. And so these photos were published, and they had, like, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, actually came out and said that yes, these were true photos. Like, he did the research and believed that these were true photos of fairies, and it was quite the to-do at the time. So yeah, this story is kind of loosely based around that actual happening in history. So instead of the Cottingley fairies, it's Lady Angelica Cottington and her story. So it starts when she's about 7, and it begins benignly enough, right? She, when she's 7, she actually captures let me just go to the page here. She actually captures in her book, it's a pressed fairy book, so it's her flower pressing book, and she actually catches a fairy and presses it into her book. And she also has written in, written in little, what are they called? Diary entries that go along with it. So for the very first one, it says July 6th, 1895, Nana wouldn't believe me. Etty wouldn't believe me. Auntie Mercy wouldn't believe me. But I got one. Now they've got to believe me, because she's now got a pressing of the fairy. And then the next day, July 7th, 1895, I showed my fairy to Etty, but she said Nana would be cross because my book is for pressing flowers in, not fairies. So I won't show it to anybody. I'm going to fill my book up with fairies. So there. So her little 7-year-old self wrote those entries at the very beginning, and that's the beginning of her venture into fairydom, if you will. So as the story progresses, she gets older, because it does go through until she's 21. She gets older and she becomes more involved with the fairies. They become easier to catch. They become more present in her life. And also as she ages in her diary writings, you also come to see that she starts to have some troubles with men. And that as the fairies become more involved, they become less inhibited, and they actually lead her into a lot of these troubles with men, or they trick her into these troubles with men. So it's a very entertaining read. It's definitely not for children. It is an adult book. And there are just some gorgeous depictions of fairies in here, done by Brian Froud. One thing to know about Brian Froud is he was also the conceptual designer for the movies Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. So you will see some, what shall we call them, similarities to this between his illustrations and those movies that kind of have a similar aesthetic to them. But yeah, so this book, I love it. It was a wonderful introduction to the idea of fairies. So there's actually a spell for summoning fairies in it. Back at the beginning, let me find it here for you. It says, The Fairy Call, a spell for summoning fairies. Sit where the cat sits, cross your toes, close your eyes and smell a rose. Then say under your breath, I believe in fairies, sure as death. Gadflickins, Gadtrapins, Gutterpuss and Cass, come to me fairily, each lad and lass. So it's got a lot of interesting, just little snippets like that in it. I quite enjoyed it. Now, the things that I really enjoyed about this is it's not your typical depiction of fairies. So like here's another book I have with little fairies in it, right? And these are your typical children's fairies, right? They're like little girls, beautiful women with wings, right? Maybe they've got little flowers for hats, that kind of an idea. And Brian Froud just blows that right out of the water. He's like, nope, nope, nope. That is not what fairies look like. So it includes goblins and imps and all the different creatures of the fairy realm. And in the writing, in the telling, it goes through this idea of fairies seeming to be benign, but then they'll lead you into trouble, right? The idea that you shouldn't trust them, that you shouldn't get involved with them because they're going to lead to all kinds of trouble in your life. I just think that is very much, it's a callback to those traditional ideas of fairy from the Celtic lands, right? Specifically Ireland, Scotland. And they have, instead of fairies, they call them the Sidhe. And the Sidhe are a race of tricksters. And they're like semi-deities, they're spirits, and they are not to be messed with. And I think that that sort of becomes apparent as you read through this book. And at the end, there are some really funny pictures in here. Now, Brian Froud, like I had said, originally he wrote, I don't know if I said this, originally he had written a book called Fairies in 1978. I'll be honest, I've never seen it. I don't have a copy of it. And in 1991, he came out with this work with Terry Jones. He has a lot of other works out there as well. And it was followed up in 1998. He wrote a book called Good Fairies, Bad Fairies. And it's actually more like it's written as a, what shall we call it? Like an encyclopedia of good fairies and bad fairies. So if you want to see some absolutely amazing artwork, just Google Brian Froud fairies and some really amazing work will come up because he has done a lot of work with the fairy world. And yeah, I just really appreciate that it's a real callback to those traditional ideas of the fairies as tricksters, that they're not to be trusted, that they'll lead you down the wrong path and get you in trouble. And yeah, it's just a good callback to the Sidhe. So yeah, anyways, that is Lady Cottington's pressed fairy book. I suggest you check it out if you can get your hands on a copy. It is, it's a classic in my opinion, and it's a quick read, but a very entertaining read. Have you read it? Do you have it? Leave me a comment. I'd love to know what you thought about it. Otherwise, we'll catch you in the next one. Mwah! Thanks, guys.